Hi, everybody. This is Walt Cassidy. I'm coming to you from Central Brooklyn. The date is March 25th, 2020, and I'm going to be reading from my book New York Club Kids by Waltpaper, and this is chapter 4, which is called House Culture. After our first year at SVA, we all decided to move out of the Greystone Hotel and get real apartments downtown. Ricky got a tiny efficiency room at the George Washington Hotel, and Casey and I moved into a 3-floor apartment with Lila in Gramercy Park on East 22nd Street. This was a great location because it was in close proximity to many of the clubs that I was now working at. Lila and Casey occupied the top floor, and I was in the dungeon at the bottom. While we lived in that apartment, a whole slew of characters began to filter into my life, and this became one of the 2 primary club kid houses. The second one was around the corner on 24th Street. That apartment also had 3 floors, but was much bigger. Desi and Christopher had left their 14th Street apartment to live there. Pebbles was in a relationship with a skater boy named Matt, and they moved to the East Village. She was still hanging out and working in clubs, but she slowly began to become more focused on her boyfriend, and her participation in the club kid shenanigans dwindled. She eventually started working behind the scenes with graphic designer Gregory Holmes. Sushi had begun dating a sweet and comical guy named Artie, and together they occupied one of the top floors at 24th Street. Christopher shared another room with his new boyfriend, a young DJ from Brooklyn named William, who worked in a record store at the time but frequented the clubs with a small group of friends. William was a handsome new addition to our group. He was really tall and had this incredible bone structure in his face. He looked and dressed like the character on the Frankenberry cereal boxes and spoke like a cross between a valley girl and a housewife from deep Brooklyn. He was an expert on classic music from the 70s and 80s and soon became the DJ for the VIP lounge at Disco 2000 called Shampoo. Desi lived on the bottom floor of the 24th Street apartment with a girl named Aphrodita who was a Bronx native. She had dark graphic features and styled herself in the tradition of buxom club goddesses like Diane Brill, Toni Senecal, and Julie Jules. These archetypal club girls were often the romantic companions to club owners or superstar DJs. They reigned over VIP rooms and the velvet ropes outside of the mega clubs. Aphrodita became really close with Lila, and the 2 of them were the representative door girls from our group. Aphrodita served as the 1993 Queen of Manhattan, with Desi as the king, and had also begun dating one of the top house DJs of the time, Hex Hector. Aphrodita's best friend, with whom she had grown up, was a thin, saucy queen named Chris Couture, who would often stay with her. I first met Chris at the 14th Street apartment, where he would crash after long nights in the club before heading back home to the Bronx. Chris was hysterical, and he kept his lunchbox filled with goodies, much like Christopher Comp. He loved a cat suit and extra long clown-like eyelashes. He purchased most of his colorful plastic and vinyl gear from the store Trash and Vaudeville on St. Mark's Place, but would later become fully devoted to Vivienne Westwood and the store Untitled. At this point, there was a tiny sprinkling of new faces within the club, serving looks that appeared to be casual interpretations of the club kid aesthetic, mixed with skatewear and a little bit of hip-hop. These kids were the first glimmer of the incoming rave scene, but there were only a few of them popping up on the main dance floor at Limelight. One of them was a funky, soulful white girl named Zoe. She liked to wear baggy workwear and bib overalls combined with striped t-shirts and hoodies in a range of colors. She'd accessorize her tomboy garments with big Edie Sedgwick-type earrings, which drew attention to her incredibly beautiful face. She was extremely pale and had white blonde spiral curls that she would carve up into a grid of ponytails that covered her whole head. She was also fond of turbans and was always sucking on a lollipop. Zoe became the daughter of me and Desi and moved onto my floor of the apartment at 22nd Street, where she made a little nest for herself under the stairs. Around this time, Desi and I adopted 2 more daughters, a pair of underage Jewish girls who had grown up in Manhattan named Genitalia and Carlin Superstar. They had been sneaking out of their parents' homes to investigate clubs, and we met them when they were about 16. They came in as a team and would wear matching looks at first, donning futuristic alien masks and headgear that appeared to be a cross between my antenna hair and Desi's facial masks. They really did look like our daughters. Jenny had grown up on Central Park West with hippie parents who were deeply rooted in the bohemian and artistic culture of New York. Her mother, Lou, was a photographer and documentary filmmaker, and her father, John, was a reggae aficionado. Part of Jenny's affection for masks came from her desire not to be busted for sneaking out of the house and clubbing all night long while she was still in high school. This had happened with my roommate, Lila, who initially became known for going out topless, only using colored duct tape to create fetish-like bodices that would sparingly cover her bare breasts. She was photographed one night, and the picture ended up on page 6 in the New York Post. When her parents saw the picture, they gave her an ultimatum. She chose to move out of her parents' home and move in with me at that point. When she began attending NYU, Jenny stopped wearing masks, shaved her head, and came out of the closet with her parents about being a secret club kid. We all ended up meeting and hanging out with her parents, and they quickly embraced us all, despite our unusual looks and behavior. We would occasionally go over to their house for dinners. Her dad would bust out the weed, and we would all smoke and listen to reggae. Her mom would shoot portraits of us in one of the side rooms of the apartment. Carlin's father had a really posh apartment just off of Gramercy Park around the corner from our Club Kid compound. She came from money, which was quite obvious when we saw how opulent the apartment was. We were told that her family was rather eccentric, but we never met them. One night while our father was away, we all piled in there and spent the night hanging out, doing drugs, and watching the horror docuseries Faces of Death. That was pretty typical of our lifestyle outside of the clubs. If we weren't searching for gear and supplies to make our looks, we were hanging out in packs, trying to keep ourselves either inspired, intoxicated, or at least in a state of shock. We loved anything freaky and transgressive. The early club kids seemed to be primarily interested in becoming socialites, being written about in the press, and establishing some type of fame, however fickle it may be. Our wave was much darker and more esoteric. We really wanted to test the limits of our minds, spirits, and bodies. While we spent a lot of time shopping for gear, our conversations leaned towards the metaphysical. Desi was really into Santeria, and I had been practicing witchcraft since my early teens. We would talk for hours about ESP, telepathy, mind control, rituals, fire starting. Any subject that offered to expand our powers was welcome, and we would practice reading each other's minds or sending messages without talking. It was great. Our shopping sprees always included trips to Botanica supply stores like Enchantments or Magical Child, where we would gather potions, oils, and candles. I would find dead bumblebees in the windowsill and make up a spell, writing incantations on paper and carving out a colored candle. I'd set the dead bees on fire or stick them with pins. It was all quite innocent and silly, but it did make me feel stronger. I do think we became vessels through which a lot of interesting energy moved during this time period. Our whole lifestyle was ritualistic and geared towards finding our way to the furthest edges of the human experience. At this point, building was closed, and I had been recruited to go dance at Limelight and Palladium in these massive cages that were suspended over the main dance floors with chains. I'd grown up obsessed with the movie Flashdance, so being able to dance in these cages was a wet dream for me. The whole ritual of getting in and out of them felt so glamorous. At intervals during the night, the cages would be lowered down from the ceilings by technicians in the DJ booth. Security guards would clear the dance floor of patrons so the apparatus could land on the ground and then escort the dancer quickly from the wings of the club into the awaiting cage. After a signal was given to the DJ booth, the dancer would be lifted into the air and would remain there throughout their set. Clouds of billowing smoke would flood around the cage with throbbing strobe and laser lights cutting through the air. If I moved in certain ways, the cage would swing all over the place, which could be quite scary. At Palladium, they had a double cage for 2 dancers that they would lower to the edge of the second floor mezzanine, where a security guard would pull the cage back and lock it onto the railing. Another dancer and I would climb over the railing into the cage. Once we were inside, the guard would release the cage. It was quite an operation, but I loved all the staging aspects that were involved. It wasn't bad being chaperoned all night long by those giant sexy security guards either. While in the cage, I would quickly be covered in sweat from the rising body heat of the crowd below and the high-powered lights maneuvering all around me. The set usually lasted about 45 minutes, after which they would lower the cage back down and another dancer would step in. During this time period, I was taking acid and E regularly. It was called candy flipping when you took them together. I was having the time of my life inside those cages with my antenna hair, fishnet stockings, platform shoes, and hot shorts. I started applying my makeup as if it was running down my face because I knew that after 10 minutes in a cage, my face would start melting off anyway. My eyes started to look like giant weeping butterflies by the end of my sets. Drugs were always a big part of my nightclub adventures, but they were particularly fun at this point in time. They were accessories to the overall experience of dressing up, dancing, and meeting people. They didn't dominate. Heavy drugs would find their way in later, as they always do. In the early days, we were focused on drinking candy-colored cocktails or mushroom punches, taking acid and E, and smoking pot. Occasionally, I would take a bump of cocaine and sprinkle it on top of a bowl of weed or roll it into a joint, which was called a coolie. There was a lot of activity at Palladium. I was dancing on the weekends, and little Kenny, Desi, and Sushi started doing a party called Level 27, which was held all the way at the top of the bleachers on the second floor. We would all slavishly hike up the stairs in our platform shoes to a tiny projection booth for a free vodka cranberry cocktail. Desi loved to incorporate an obstacle into his party concepts as much as he loved masks and disguises. He was always setting himself up to endure his own difficult costumes, so his hosting and promoting responsibilities often pulled in that same type of energy, leading to some memorable nights. The goals in creating parties were to make people feel special and the event feel exclusive. Desi realized that a good way to do this was to prolong the invitation process by issuing guests a series of tasks that they had to move through in order to gain access to the event. Once he came up with a party called Shh, for which he created a conceptual invitation based on the idea of a secret. To promote the party, guests were given a real key with a printed card tag attached. The key tag had a hotline phone number on it with instructions to call the number the night of the event to obtain a secret location. Once you arrived at that location, you had to use the key to gain access to the party. The whole charade had the feel of a scavenger hunt. The hope was that by the time you got to the event, your energy and anticipation had built, and you were ready to party with the elite, in-the-know nightlife crowd. Part of our job as club kids was coming up with these kinds of ideas for our own personal parties, which would be staged within the network of smaller lounges that were scattered throughout the mega clubs. As much fun as we always had, and as outrageous as we seemed to be to other people, those of us who were part of the inner circle were actually employed and paid by the club and worked very hard. Not only were we expected to come up with party ideas and show up looking great, but we also had to promote those parties and participate in the different staging aspects that were required. We spent a lot of time behind closed doors doing the preparations. During the daytime, people were in the club's offices figuring out budgets, working on invitation and promotional design, catering dinners, booking the entertainment, and coordinating with the club's art crew and sound and lighting engineers. So many talented people worked behind the scenes of clubs like Limelight. Peter Gation's art crew was led by two incredible artists named Impala and Joey Horatio. They were the minds behind all the colorful interiors. I was always blown away by the custom wallpaper and the hand-painted stenciling that they used to do throughout the clubs. My favorite was the pink and yellow doll motif with double sets of eyes that covered the back stairwell of Limelight. Christopher Comp worked as Michael Alleg's main assistant during the heyday of Disco 2000. While Michael would be attending to the club's main administrative forces, like Peter Gation and the various managers, Christopher would serve as the point person for all of the primary club kids. He would organize us and make sure that we were up to speed on everything that needed to happen in one night, and that we were assembled in the right places at the right times. If he had information that he needed to share, he'd pass it on to us, and then we would distribute it to the masses. Word of mouth drove everything that we did. This was pre-internet, so everything was done manually. Our crew was like a veritable Club Kid Pony Express. A tremendous amount of footwork was done both inside and outside of the club. We were always on the move, always multitasking. While we would scour the city acquiring materials for our looks, we would also drop stacks of paper club invitations in every shop that we passed. On many nights, we would have to shuffle over to Michael Fazakerley's studio before we arrived to the club to be photographed for upcoming promotional material and content for Project X magazine. Fazakerley was originally from Philadelphia and amassed a mammoth archive of 35mm color and black and white studio portraits of the club kids, drag queens, and go-go boys between 1984 and 1995. The venues where we worked were massive, with multiple events happening at different times throughout the night. Once we arrived to the club, we were expected to be in certain areas at specific times to make sure the attention was focused on the right spot. Limelight served early dinners with special guests, usually someone from campy 70s television shows like Three's Company or The Jeffersons. Beginning at 10:30 p.m., dinners often followed the photo shoots at Michael Fazakerley's place. They were usually pretty hysterical, often resembling the tea party from Alice in Wonderland. The guest of honor would be someone like Tiny Tim or Janet DeWitt, and there was definitely a surreal quality to sitting at a table and chatting with someone that you had grown up watching on television. It also made for an interesting photo op to have Amanda Lepore, Sacred Boy, and Wheezy Jefferson all at the same table eating off of paper plates. After dinner, we relocated to an open bar in the Topiary Lounge at the front of the club so that all the patrons would see a mob of club kids upon entering the doors. The earlier part of the night was usually reserved for more sober events like fashion shows or pageants such as the King and Queen of Manhattan. We held nightlife's version of the Academy Awards, the Glammies, and of course the Style Summits. Later on in the night, things could get pretty messy with the hot body contests, in which Larry T. and Lahoma would recruit people from the audience to take their clothes off on the main stage for a small cash prize. There was always something funny and shocking going on for entertainment. Within the broader group of the club kids, a few of us bonded tightly together and formed a sub-clique that we started referring to as UFO, which stood for United Freaks Orbiting. To prove our commitment to each other, we each got a tattoo from a drawing that I had made of a spaceship with legs and platform shoes. By this time, Astro Earl, Desi, and I had formed a trinity of sorts. Not that we weren't just as close with everyone else, but the three of us were often hired as a team to go-go dance or host together. While many of the other club kids tended to stay sequestered back in the VIP lounges, the three of us loved to be in the belly of the beast, right in the middle of the main dance floor. Because I was usually go-go dancing, I noticed and connected with a lot of other dancers. On the main floors, there was always an interesting crew of Black and Latin voguers who were affiliated with the ball scene. These dancers were incredible, and they could often be seen playfully battling each other or testing their powers against rival camps of breakdancers. People would form supportive circles around these battles, encouraging the dancers to push the movements further and further. The lighting techs would sometimes throw spotlights on these groups, and they would serve as spontaneous performances for the rest of the crowd. Each dancer would tell a story about who they were through their movements, the same way the club kids defined our identities through our outfits. I met a beautiful girl named Karen while living at the Greystone Hotel. Her boyfriend had recently been shot and killed. One night she entered one of these dance circles and began to interpret the story of what had happened, illustrating her feelings of mourning through the movements. Everyone around the circle was aware of what had happened and stood by to cradle her through this transcendent expression of pain and healing. It was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen, and it reinforced in my mind the power and potential that music, dancing, community, and these nightclubs that I now occupied had to offer. We were playing out rituals of celebration and transformation that had existed since the beginning of time. As we learned how to navigate the obstacles of our young lives and find our place in the world, magic swirled all around us, night after night, song after song. I became close with a group of queens from the House of L'Amour named Anthony, Blue, and Princess. They all frequented the big clubs where I worked, and we found ourselves spending a lot of time on the dance floor together. After the clubs closed, they would often come over to our Club Kid house on 22nd Street for after hours. Eventually, they asked me to become a member of the House of L'Amour, and I enthusiastically agreed. The house's father, Caesar, who was originally a member of the House of Ninja and the House of Magnifique, oversaw everything. The mother was a larger-than-life trans woman named Consuela Cosmetic, who would later become the subject of the tragic documentary Mirror, Mirror. I never got too involved with the actual ball circuit. I only really knew the contingent from hanging out in clubs. I did end up walking a couple categories at a L'Amour ball that was once held at Palladium. The categories were Freaky Alien and Footwear, both of which I had mastered pretty well. Having shared occupancy of the House of Magnifique, Caesar and Princess were ballroom veterans who helped pioneer the crossover of ball culture to the nightclub circuit. Caesar had danced with Michelle Visage on the television show Latin Connection. Other visionary personalities who led the way in bringing ball culture into the nightclubs of downtown Manhattan included Willie Ninja, Jerome Pendavis, Adrian and Eileen Magnifique, and Danny, Angie, Jose, and David Ian Extravaganza. The ball scene had been vibrant for decades in Harlem, long before it was embraced in downtown clubs. Much like hip-hop, balls didn't begin to strongly cross-pollinate with the lower Manhattan scene until the 1980s. The force most responsible for ushering the ball circuit into wider public awareness was the clothing store located on 10 East 8th Street, Patricia Field. Patricia Field was the conduit through which all circuits of trendy downtown culture flowed throughout the 80s and 90s. Nightlife, fashion, art, design, music, and street culture all collided in a beautiful explosion of talent and inspiration at this tiny, below-ground hub. Pat herself was a pioneer, not only within the realm of fashion, but also as an ambassador of New York City and the LGBTQ community. The store employed and cultivated talent from a broad spectrum of multicultural lesbian, gay, and transgender individuals. She created an inspiring and sustainable forum for eccentric creatives whose lifestyles and identity expressions might curtail opportunities for employment in the dominantly heteronormative world. The individual responsible for initiating contact and for the store's subsequent participation in the uptown ball circuit was a young employee named Princess Myra. It was Myra, along with a small group of store employees, who created the House of Field and began staging a series of balls downtown after introducing the house by walking categories at the Elks Lodge and balls in Harlem. The father of the house was Patricia Field, and the mother was Tim Bailey Field. As is often the case with house culture, birth gender does not dictate parental delineation, but rather one's gender temperament. The strict codes of the uptown houses allowed very little room or acceptance for the Fields, as described in Chichi Valenti's Nations article for details. Quote, inside the ball community, many considered the Fields essentially limited to the punk rock satanic versus new wave category. They have their own weird look, the mother of one house explained, and I don't accept their look. I can only see that if one of my kids is walking in that type of category. End quote. Princess Myra first met Pat Field at the Paradise Garage, which was a hotbed of voguing and shade. The House of Extravaganza held a lot of space there, as well as at Trax, the other club that strongly facilitated ball culture's transition downtown. Myra began battling and sparring with members of Extravaganza at the Garage, which led to a friendship with Pat. Willie Ninja and Jose Extravaganza taught Myra and other members of the newly developing House of Field moves and techniques. The House of Field held their first ball at the World. Afterward, Time magazine contacted Princess Myra for an article on voguing. It was that article that caused student director Jenny Livingston to contact Myra, asking that they attend some of the balls together. Livingston was in the early stages of shooting footage for what would become the documentary Paris is Burning. As Livingston gathered footage, she would sometimes bring it into the store on A Street to be viewed. While Livingston's film is widely cited as the seminal documentary on ball culture, the real pioneering film was actually made in 1982, just before the advent of AIDS, and it's called TV Transvestite. The film was directed by Simone de Bagno and Michele Capozzi and documents a fierce ball held by the House of La Beja in a bingo hall in Harlem. It was first screened in Rome with audience members like Federico Fellini and Michelangelo Antonioni, who marveled at its beauty. It then traveled back to New York to be screened at Paradise Garage, where Andy Warhol and Keith Haring viewed it. Featured in the film are Pepper LaBeija, Dorian Corey, and its main narrator, Sugar. TV Transvestite was all but buried due to music copyright laws, but it's quite apparent that Livingston found great inspiration in it and quote-unquote borrowed much of the film's format, structure, and shot composition. Unfortunately, she did not borrow the love, color, and joy that the film exudes, and instead cast a somewhat dark and scrutinizing view onto her subjects, something she's been widely criticized for within the ball community. Nevertheless, the documentary remains an iconic and historic view of the scene that might otherwise have been hidden from mainstream audiences. The House of Field held their second ball on Grand Street on the anniversary of the closing of Paradise Garage. As a follow-up to the first, it ignited waves of excitement and wonder, not just downtown and uptown, but also in the selection of judges that the Fields assembled to hold court over the event, including Stephen Meisel, Andre Leon Talley, Debbie Harry, Malcolm McLaren, Mary McFadden, Willie Ninja Field, Diane Brill, Tim Field, and Patricia Field. The House of Field had caught the attention of the fashion and music industry. Most of the judges, like many people in attendance, had never been to a ball and had no idea what the categories meant, how to walk them, or how to judge them. Myra served as the ball's professor and MC, schooling the judges and the participants on the criteria for each category. There were numerous heated conflicts between houses, which was expected at any ball and always added to the excitement. Caesar Ninja Magnifique L'Amour, who performed in the Butch Queen Vogue Black Style of Strength category, initially received a questionably low score of 6 from Andre Leon Talley. Caesar challenged his low marking and went about working for a better score while battling the next competitor. Talley changed his score to 10 as Princess Myra Field explained to the crowd the concepts of working and battling. Caesar walked away with the trophy. He also caught the eye of Judge Malcolm McLaren, which led to a collaboration between them and House of Field member Willie Ninja Field and a tour to promote McLaren's subsequent singles Deep in Vogue and Waltz Darling. The House of Field continued to stage balls of their own at various venues, as well as participating in and securing a number of legendary moments across the ball circuit. One of these seismic moments came when Pat Field's girlfriend, House of Field member Yo-Yo, or Rebecca Field, entered the House of Ecstasy's Affluence Ball at Red Zone, completely nude and on horseback, emulating Lady Godiva for the category of femme fatale. Not only did the Fields snatch the prize, but they also left an indelible impression on all who were in attendance. Photographer Tina Paul was on hand to catch this moment, as were many others. She too was a member of the House of Field and always lovingly captured and supported nightlife's elaborate and often spontaneous creative stagings. For every turn or shift of the scene, she was right there with her camera positioned at the center of the action. The club kids managed to find a small bit of space within the ball circuit that was now thoroughly cross-pollinating with downtown nightlife. Michael Alec injected some humor by creating the House of Pancakes, serving actual pancakes to the judges for a category at one of the balls. Julie Jules frequently walked for the House of Extravaganza, Kenny Kenny became a Magnifique, and Ernie Glam could be seen walking in the Shady Face category at the Field's Grand Street Ball. After the House of Field had staged a number of their hugely successful balls, breaking new ground, Suzanne Barsh followed their lead with a vision and a need to take action in response to the devastating AIDS crisis. Barsh used all of her resources and contacts within the fashion, nightlife, and celebrity communities to create the spectacular Love Ball benefit, which was held at the Roseland Ballroom in 1989. Mainstream fashion houses participated, and famous artists like Keith Haring created custom trophies for the categories. The event garnered a tremendous amount of press, with all proceeds donated to DIFA, Design Industries Foundation Fighting AIDS. Through this event, Barsh was able to raise an extraordinary amount of funds and set a new standard for taking action in the fight against AIDS. The poster boy of the House of Field, representative of the Shady Face category, and visual director for the Patricia Field store was a beautiful creature named Jojo Americo Field. I first saw Jojo at the building where he worked the door with another scene beauty and House of Field member, Richard Alvarez. Every member of the House of Field was stunningly beautiful and very sophisticated in whatever angle they were pushing. Pat Field's children were tough, street-savvy, and culturally diverse. That store was the cornerstone of everything fierce in New York City. Pat also had the vision to foster the early talent of artists like Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, both of whom made t-shirts for the store, as well as young designer Andre Walker. The interior aesthetics of the 8th Street store were unforgettable, not only for the clothing and the staff, but also in large part for the colorful murals that the artist and House of Field member Martine had painted all throughout the dressing rooms. His work was featured in all of the store's branding, including bags, magazine advertisements, and custom-made clothing like hand-painted denim jackets. Martine's siren-like imagery iconicized the House of Field aesthetic codes of urban sex appeal, strength, and androgyny. Although the store was quite small in scale, everything Field was larger than life, from the bodies, hair, and makeup to the attitude and the talent. I remember seeing Jojo walking down the street near Building one night en route to Limelight. He was wearing a billowing leopard print jacket and black thigh-high boots that accentuated his already naturally long legs. His hair was done up in a wig made of giant barrel curls, a signature of the House of Field member, master wigmaker Perfidia. He looked like a sexy tarantula sauntering down the sidewalk. Even in all that guiche and the outfit, Jojo still managed to look like a tough New York City boy. He always wore a goatee or graphic facial hair of some kind to contrast any femme queen effects that he was serving. Jojo stood out for being distinctly rock and roll. His personal style was a car crash of references to bands like Led Zeppelin, the Ronettes, and Alice Cooper. He also had his own band, JoJo and the Jockstraps, with fellow House of Field members Paul Alexander and Lonnie Barnes. It would be safe to say that JoJo at that time was regarded as the coolest person in New York. He, along with many of the personalities that worked at Pat's, held a lot of space in the big nightclubs. While the store did not employ club kids, many of the members of the House of Field were thoroughly integrated into our scene. People like Robbie Martin, Cody Ravioli, and Chicklet all frequented or worked at club kid-oriented parties. Jewelry designer Maria Ayala was another highly recognized club personality who was also at the core of the House of Field. After moving to New York from Texas, she first secured a job at the store's makeup counter. In response to encouragement by JoJo to check out the plastic supply stores on Canal Street for inspiration, she began her own jewelry line. Her most recognizable creations were the oversized drop earrings inspired by the 1960s mod and flower power culture and assembled from a wide range of colorful pieces of plastic. The line was a huge hit with shoppers, magazine editors, and clubgoers and was an essential ingredient to the House of Field look as the 90s began. The mainstream public would become familiar with her pieces as they were worn by Lady Miss Keir when deee-lite's hit Groove Is in the Heart broke through the airwaves and onto MTV. Bombshell transgender beauty the Connie Girl, Connie Fleming, was a high-profile member of the House of Field. She was a dynamic Jamaican-born fashion model and performer who became known for her signature gymnastic cartwheels and full splits, all done in stiletto heels. Connie was a boy bar beauty and the physical manifestation of Martine's paintings. In addition to walking for the House of Field, she also modeled for Vivienne Westwood and Terry Mugler. I first saw Connie when she would dance in the cages at Limelight. She alternated sets with another stunner named Richard Move, a trained dancer and choreographer who would later be celebrated for his impressive tributes to Martha Graham. Move was tightly woven into the fiber of the Tuesday night party Jackie 60, which was staged in the meatpacking district with DJ Johnny Dynell, Chichi Valenti, Kitty Boots, and later Hattie Hathaway. Jackie 60 was strongly aligned with the House of Field, with Dynell being a house member and serving as resident DJ at the various balls staged by the Fields. The Jackie 60 formula was first configured and incubated at Nell's before quickly moving further west down 14th Street to the venue that would eventually become Mother. The night was strategically performance-oriented and designed to cater to an intelligent underground crowd drawn in by the night's witty and humorous weekly themes. These themes reflected the literary influence of Chichi Valenti. One of the first Jackie 60 themes was Lilies of the Field, a night to showcase the talent in the House of Field while they were still at Nell's. The door policy at Jackie 60 was strictly coded, according to the weekly themes and thoroughly enforced by Kitty Boots. The whole experience was specialized, and you knew that if you were allowed into the club, it was because you had earned it on some level. House of Field member Paul Alexander would famously MC the proceedings with his signature banter. He would call out the names of notable individuals from the scene who were present, and it became a badge of honor to have Paul say that you were, quote-unquote, in the house. Alexander first developed his technique at the maxi record loft parties thrown by Kevin McHugh in an effort to smooth over the transitions of different people jumping in to play records. It was at one of the first Jackie 60 parties at Nell's that he began to MC over DJ Johnny Dynell's mixes. Upon seeing an empty stage with a spotlight, he couldn't resist jumping up and grabbing the microphone. Dynell was so impressed with his stylings that he invited Paul to be the permanent MC for the party. The Jackie 60 crew was highly critical of the club kids, yet oddly inclusive at the same time. They had a quote-unquote no club kid door policy, even going so far as to post a Ghostbusters-like sign displaying an illustrated lunchbox with an X through it. One of their funnier themes was titled Silence of the Lunch Pails, Have the It Twins Stopped Screaming Yet? The tagline on the invitation read, Bring me the head of Julie Jules. The theme was a reference to the Silence of the Lambs, and both Michael Alec and James St. James participated in the evening. Having the Jackie 60 crew take jabs at you was a bit like being parodied on Saturday Night Live. They could be cutting, but their shade was also validating at the same time. The Jackie 60 clique had a lot of ties to the fetish and domination community, which were reflected in their posturing and enforcement of themes. They actually liked and were supportive of a number of the club kids, especially members of our group of second-wave club kids like Kabuki, Desi Monster, Genitalia, and myself. But at Jackie, in the spirit of true domination, you always needed to know who was boss. Being a part of the House of Field was the ultimate stamp of fierceness in New York. When I got to know some of those people, I realized that there might be additional social space for me outside of my cherished Club Kid circle. Jojo had been one of the judges at the Style Summit pageant where I had taken the title, and afterwards for his birthday party at Palladium, he released a poster invitation featuring a list of his fabulous 500 personalities in New York. I was the only Club Kid name listed in the group and was completely blown away. From that moment on, Jojo took me under his wing as a sort of baby brother. He also invited me to be a part of the House of Field and to work in the newly opened 6th Avenue store. Although I had no real interest or experience in retail, I was not going to pass that up. I had no idea what I was going to do in the store, but I was totally in, graciously accepting the $75 per day gig. I was tossed all over that store when I started. At first, I helped Jojo with upholstery and windows as the store was still being built and refined. I would test my hands in the wig department with Perfidia and the makeup section with Armin Ra. Cody Ravioli taught me how to fold t-shirts, and I worked the floor with Raven O as he did the cash register. When I showed up for my shift in the morning, it wasn't unusual to see Raven engaging in numerous pirouettes while a soundtrack of Ike and Tina Turner's greatest hits blasted through the sound system. I found Raven to be quite intimidating, but I marveled at his talent and got a really good musical education while working those shifts with him. Luckily, little Kenny, who had a strong background in retail, had started working at the A Street store a little before me. He did everything he could to help school me and get me into the flow of working a job like that. Soon after, Genitalia was brought on board too. We were the first proper Club Kids to work at Pat Field's. Some personalities like Lauren Pine with her doll-like makeup and tightly cinched waist predated the Club Kids and pioneered some of the aesthetics that would come to inform our development. But we were the first who actually identified as Club Kids to come under the umbrella of the House of Field. The Pat Field's crew, like many people, was incredibly skeptical of Club Kids, especially the first wave ones, and no one threw shade quite like the Fields. They knew they were at the top of the scene's pecking order, and if you were to be accepted in their world, you had to earn it. You needed to show that you had something interesting to offer before you were fully embraced. Even though I was making more money out at the clubs, I did try to find my place while working in the store. I was so happy to meet all these new people and be a part of such a dynamic ensemble of personalities. I started walking in fashion shows with them, which I really enjoyed, and my looks evolved as a result of my affiliation. Elder members of the club scene also started to open up and warm to me as I proved that I had something to offer outside of their preconceived notions of Club Kids. Established House of Field members like Perfidia were really helpful in introducing me to new materials to create my looks. He had developed the wig department for the store in the 1980s by first placing a few random clip-on ponytails above the makeup counter. Over time, this grew into his own section of the store, which he oversaw. I knew nothing about wigs and turned to Perfidia to help manifest my budding interest. I had some pretty absurd ideas at first. As with makeup, it took me a minute to find my flow and figure out what my particular angle would be in regards to hair. He was very supportive and would always attempt to bring to life something I would sketch out on a piece of paper. I came to realize that I didn't like the overly rigid wig styles towards which many of the other queens seemed to gravitate. They felt too drag-oriented. There were enough people doing that look and doing it well. I thought it was more interesting to treat wigs like hair. I didn't want it to look real necessarily, but I didn't want it to look costume-like either. I learned that I could have tiny combs sewn into the lining of any wig that I bought, which allowed me to wear them a little further back on my head as a fall, exposing my real hairline in the front. The combs also gave me freedom of movement while go-go dancing and running all over town night after night. I never had to worry about my hair falling off no matter what kind of predicament I got myself into. At some point, I noticed that Tobel von Cartier, another club kid who would be brought into the House of Field, was really talented at creating custom wigs by sewing different colored tracks into existing pieces. I started commissioning her to customize every new wig that I bought. After she worked her magic on them, I'd go about beating them up and breaking them in. Wigs are not unlike jeans. You have to live in them for a bit before they really become your own. I'd wrap them up, spray them with Aquanet, wear them a few times, then soak them in Woolite and let them air dry. I'd never brush out the tangles since they look better if they remained clumpy, sort of like bedhead. Changing their hair with every outfit inspired many of the queens. Again, I thought that was a bit too costumey for me, so I would wear the same hair for months, treating it more like hair rather than a wig. Even though I was dressing up and creating looks, I wanted everything to appear lived in and casual. It seems quite strange to even use the word casual when you consider what I looked like at that time, but I really did want people to see who I was. I wasn't hiding behind a guise or performing as some type of conceived character. Little Kenny and genitalia ended up doing quite well at Pat's. Kenny eventually moved on to being a buyer for the store and also staged a number of successful House of Field fashion presentations. As much as I tried, I could never really find my flow with retail. I loved the whole environment, but I didn't have the hustle in me to sell clothes or makeup. I was a painter and an illustrator. Aside from occasionally assisting JoJo, there wasn't much opportunity for me to use those skills in the store. Pat Field herself was absent for most of the time that I worked there. When she came back, she took me into her office and asked me what I wanted to do and where my passion resided. I told her that my real focus was on painting and drawing, not retail. She explained that she already had JoJo to do visuals and things of that nature, which of course I knew since he hired me. There really wasn't a place for me in that particular environment, and I was very politely fired. I gladly remained close and affiliated with the House of Field. I continued to model in their fashion shows, and one of my signature looks, the t-shirt dress, even became a staple in the store for a period of time. As a kid, I loved wearing my dad's oversized white t-shirts as dresses and to sleep in them at night. I found myself wanting to create that same effect that I had loved as a kid, but I had to find a way around the fact that I had grown to be so tall. I realized that if I pieced together 3 stretched out t-shirts, one on top of the other, I could achieve the same effect. I had no sewing skills, but secured them together by hand the best I could using some leftover yarn. The piece came out really well and was super comfortable and reinforced my commitment to keeping my look casual. Soon after I created that first t-shirt dress, little Kenny got inspired by the look, took the idea to a production house and created a refined, sellable version for the store. He added graphics, which was a hallmark of his look, and mixed in different colored fabrics. They became a pretty big hit, and a number of club kids were seen stumbling around in these t-shirt dresses and giant platform shoes for about a year. Kenny had a gift for picking up on moments in the clubs and cultivating those seeds into products that could then be sold at Pat's store. He continued to thrive there for many years as the store grew and changed. When the 8th Street store and 6th Avenue locations closed, Sushi and his boyfriend Artie picked up where Kenny had left off. They oversaw the store's reopening in a number of different locations, including Soho as Hotel Venus and the Bowery. Desi also got involved with the store and designed a number of windows and some displays at the newer locations. The tone and styling changed quite a bit during this time period, but the impact remained the same. In 2016, Patricia Field permanently closed her store after gaining much notoriety and multiple awards for her television and film costume styling. She continues to cultivate and support new talent through a number of independent art-themed presentations, but the personalities that embodied the House of Field throughout the 80s and the 90s remain one of her most referenced and celebrated legacies.